Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're joined by a brand new guest. Her name is Amanda Udis-Kessler. She's written an amazing book, a very important book, especially for the times that we are in, called Abundant Lives, a Progressive Christian Ethic of Flourishing. And so Amanda, welcome to the podcast. I love your work. I've been excited to connect with you.
Thank you so much for having me here. Happy to be
De-
here.
yeah, definitely. So before we get into the book, can you maybe take a few moments to introduce yourself to our listeners? Sometimes podcasters do the intro for the guest and kind of read it, but I don't know. I always feel funny reading a person's bio because you know a lot more about you than I do. So maybe tell us about yourself. Who are you? What do you do? A day in the life of Amanda.
Sure. I have a pretty wide range of kind of creative and intellectual projects. If we start with my kind of identities rather than the projects, I started out as a secular Jew, spent 30 years with the Unitarian Universalists, and have now hopped over into progressive Christianity. I also identify as a queer left-leaning feminist, and those identities absolutely kind of inhabit all of my work.
Hmm.
Um, in my day job, I'm a college administrator. I used to be a professor, but I didn't love grading, and I didn't have great chalkboard writing skills. Handwriting was pretty bad, so
Right.
moved into admin. Then on the creative front, I write a lot of free use progressive religious music, so hymns, worship songs, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, I write books. I'm a sociologist by training and something of a self-taught ethicist, which is where this book we're going to talk about today comes in. Um, and so I have an earlier book about the LGBT inclusion struggle in the United Methodist Church. That's an academic book and it's from years ago. The three writing projects I'm really excited about right now. One came out last year. It was put together by a collective, and it is called A Liturgy for All Bodies, New Words for a New World.
Mm.
We can talk about that or not. The book we're talking about today, Abundant Lives, A Progressive Christian Ethic of Flourishing, has been a long time in development. And I'm so delighted that it's out and people seem to be using it in book clubs and things like that. And I have a sociology book coming out in the summer called Cultural Processes of Inequality, Sociological Perspective. So I'm especially interested in where sociology, progressive religion, ethics, and social justice come together. But
Mm.
on the lighter side, I am a huge fan of both British baking shows and British police procedurals. And finally, I'm a big fan of selected series of Star Trek, but only selected series.
There you go. I like it. I never got into Star Trek, Star Wars, anything like that. I tried to when I was a kid, and it just didn't stick for me for some reason. And I find that people who are in that world are really either really in it or they're not in it at all. I feel like there's no way, there's nobody who's in between.
Uh-huh.
All right, so I'm really interested to hear a little bit about more about your story because I'm sure that's going to take us into the book because you seem like you're coming to this topic. You seem like you're coming to life from a variety of different perspectives that you've had over the course of your life. So I'm really interested to hear a little bit more about kind of how you were raised in terms of your faith, like what your faith life was like when you were younger, kind of like where you're at today with God and the divine, and maybe some of the highs and lows and things that took you from there to here to write this book and to do the other work that you're doing.
So, unlike so many of the people I talk to when I do these kinds of podcasts, I'm not coming out of evangelical Christianity. So I've never had to deconstruct and I've never had to reconstruct. I've actually had to construct. I
Hmm.
grew up a secular Jew in New York City. Um, and when my
What is a secular Jew, if you could define that for me?
Sure. So it is someone who is Jewish by heritage and often in at least some ways by culture, as in some of the kinds of things I like to eat, or the holidays are kind of culturally meaningful for me, even if the concrete specifics of the story are not deeply embedded in me.
Sure.
Um, you know, I'm trying to think of how else to talk about this because no one else has ever asked that question. That's really
Sorry.
interesting. No, it's great.
Curveball.
No, I think there are things about kind of Jewish sensibility that that are really different from a lot of what Christianity has been because of
Yep.
where it mostly wound up developing. So even though it started as an offshoot of Judaism,
Hmm.
um, the people who kind of took it up and shaped it and made it what it is were not only not Jews, but they were really culturally pretty different from the Jews of their day.
Yeah.
So
Makes
we
sense.
can come back to that.
Hmm.
But growing up secular simply means my parents weren't religious. They were not observant Jews. I mean, forget Orthodox, they weren't even really Reform Jews.
Hmm.
So I didn't grow up in any religious tradition. But by the time I was a teenager, I was definitely on a spiritual search or a
Hmm.
religious search. So my joke is that my friends in high school were sneaking out to get stoned, and I was sneaking out to try out religious services.
I love it.
Um, and and I did quite a bit of that, but what would often happen, this is New York in the late 70s, early 80s, and what would often happen is I would go to a service, I would find it interesting and thought-provoking, and afterwards I would ask the leader or the person doing the greeting or whatever, how that religious tradition felt about homosexuality, and the answers were virtually always negative, and so I would walk away and go, okay, that's definitely not for me. I need a place where I can be my whole self. And I came out fairly young, and so that quest was definitely uh, deepened by the accident of my music directing a production of Godspell when I was 15 or 16 at my high school, and being just deeply and profoundly moved by that experience, by the music, by the vision of community that it provided, um, by the idea that there were very different ways of kind of thinking about the world. Um, so my first engagement after that with religion was really kind of academic. I studied comparative religion in college, and I found my way to the Unitarian Universalists as still an entirely secular person because my Chinese thought and religion professor was supposed to give a talk at the Unitarian Fellowship in my college town. He couldn't go. He sent me to give the talk. And that began a kind of a 30-year or so relationship with the UUs. Um, I still have really warm feelings toward that tradition, which is a kind of a non-creedal liberal offshoot of Christianity
Mm,
that invites people to journey together, even when the specifics of their journeys are different. I have a lot of respect for that, but ultimately, I needed to choose to enter into a story that was larger than myself, that made demands that I really was not experiencing in the UU setting.
mm,
Um, and also a tradition that I thought was more upfront about how morally complicated people are. So
mm,
I've tried to find kind of a way of engaging religiously and spiritually that rejects both the too easy depravity of at least stereotypical Calvinism. I mean, clearly human beings are capable of doing amazing, beautiful, wonderful, loving, creative things. So I don't want to write us off too quickly. And at the same time, in the Unitarian Universalist tradition, there can be a kind of optimism about humanity that I look at the world and I don't see. And
mm,
I honestly find that optimism to be a little bit too white and upper middle class. And I am white and upper middle class, but it seems so socially located. I can't sort of accept it without a struggle. And so I feel as though in the kind of teachings and actions of Jesus, we see someone who was um, well aware of both the capacities and the frailties of human beings, and who nonetheless invited people to be our best selves, and
mhm.
that's how I've kind of come to engage with the Christian story. I sometimes call myself a progressive Christian, but especially here in Colorado Springs, which is the evangelical Vatican of the US.
Right.
The term Christian has all sorts of associations that are not true for me. So when I have longer to explain, I will sometimes call myself a universalist, non doctrinal, stumbling Jesus follower.
Right. That sums it up, right?
Yeah.
That sums it up. All right. So I mentioned in my email, and I wanted to share this with our listeners to kind of give a little bit of context to our discussion, but also my a question I have for you. But what intrigued me the most, I think, about your book when you sent it to me, and thank you, by the way, for sending me a copy. But what intrigued me the most is that made me want to read it. Is I've been in this place of deconstruction because I grew up in a conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical universe. That was my life for many years, and so I've been rethinking things now for like 6, 7 years or so. And about maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years, like just after COVID, I really came to like recognize in my own life how easy it is to leave my ethics, so to speak, as a more progressive leaning Christian these days in the comment sections of my and various people's social media pages. Like it's so easy to take our beliefs and make them all, and our morals strictly intellectual, like so much that our ideas come out of our fingers, they go to the keyboard, they go on the screen, we have our discussion, and then we just kind of leave it there and we go on with our lives. But your book really challenges us to not just think about what we believe, but think about like what we believe even outside of our own faith, because the things you talk about in this book go well beyond the Christian faith or any other faith. And really, like, what can we do to create a better world where everybody has the opportunity to flourish? And so, what I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about is kind of going back to the subtitle of the book. Like, number one, what is a progressive Christian? Because I feel like that's a buzzword. It's a buzz label, and I feel like everybody would define that a little bit differently. So when we talk about progressive Christian, like what exactly does that mean? And then an ethic of flourishing, like what is a an ethic of flourishing? And if we were to take that and put that to work in our world, like what sorts of things would begin to change?
Sure. So I'm going to cheat a little bit on the progressive Christian definition and actually go with the definition that is in the book, which I got with permission from the website of progressivechristianity.org. I simply think they've done the best job of
It
articulating
is a
this.
very good.
So
It is a very good definition.
so that's why I'm not only lazy, I'm also, respectful of the
I love
text.
it.
Um, but on that website, they say progressive Christians can be understood as people who believe that following the way and teachings of Jesus can lead to experiencing sacredness, wholeness, and unity of all life, even as we recognize that the Spirit moves in beneficial ways in many faith traditions. So that's part one. To seek community that is inclusive of all people, honoring differences in theological perspective, age, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, class, or ability. And I'm just going to say there's a whole bunch of other differences they don't list, but that are kind of implied.
Mhm.
Strive for peace and justice among all people, knowing that behaving with compassion and selfless love toward one another is the fullest expression of what we believe. Embrace the insights of contemporary science and strive to protect the earth and ensure its integrity and sustainability. And finally, commit to a path of lifelong learning, believing there is more value in questioning than in absolutes. So that covers a lot of ground. It does a lot of rhetorical work.
Mhm.
And what I find interesting about it is that, and it is still the best definition I've found, but a lot of what it's doing is still saying what progressive Christians are not. I mean, it is very difficult um, to talk about progressive Christianity without talking about evangelical Christianity. And so, overwhelmingly, what progressive Christians will say is, "I don't believe this, I don't believe that, I don't believe the other thing." One of the more famous progressive Christian quotes, I wish I remembered who this is from, but all sorts of people use it, is to say, "Tell me about the God you don't believe in. I'm pretty sure I don't believe in that God either."
Yep.
So again, there is this sort of definition over and against. And even though I love the definition I just read because it is positive, it does say what we do believe, aspire to, yearn for, and so on. Um, Haunting that definition is still all of those negatives. And so, what I've tried to do in this book is take an ethic that, when I was developing it, it was a completely secular ethic. It was
Mhm.
not particularly tied to any religious tradition, and it doesn't have to be. I actually think it works really well in Buddhism as well as it happens, but let's leave that aside. But I've tried to sort of take those ideas that I had in a secular context and ask, what happens if I put them in conversation with progressive Christianity? So, drawing on some of the more thoughtful ways of reading the Bible these days, drawing on some of the more interesting progressive Christian theological work that's coming out of the academy, but also out of um, pastors who write but may not be kind of traditional academics and so on. Um, and so the basic idea of flourishing is that we have a long history, and especially we in kind of the Western European descended traditions have a long history of ethics coming out of philosophy and being built on certain processes of reasoning. So it's very
Hmm.
common to take an idea or a claim or a value and then build an ethics around it. So libertarianism is basically a kind of ethics of freedom and liberty.
Hmm.
It says the highest priority is freedom and liberty. Let's see what we can build from there.
Hmm.
Or you can take John Rawls and the Rawlsian Justice Project and ask, so if justice is the most important thing, how do we build an ethics around that? And I have plenty of respect for those approaches, but as a sociologist, I find that way of reasoning, I won't say suspect, but quite imperfect because it doesn't take into account the social context of who is using freedom language and who is using rights language or justice language. What are they using it to do? What's their project? Who benefits from their project? Who suffers from their project? And so, in the first part of the book, I talk a couple of different times about mass shootings, um, and the the moment that really got this project off the ground, even though I'd had some ideas about it prior, it was the moment when I ran into a quote by a recently deceased right-wing media personality, Joe the Plummel Wurzelbacher, who wrote after the 2014 shooting by Elliot Rogers in California. He wrote an open letter to the parents of the kids who'd been killed. And he says in this letter, among other things, um, as harsh as this may sound, your dead kids don't trump my constitutional gun rights. He
Hmm.
doesn't use the word gun, but it's pretty clear that's what he means. And I read that and my universe just stopped. I was floored. I was literally breathless. And I went, this is so morally wrong. This is an abomination. But what's wrong with it? Why am I having that reaction? What are my assumptions that are causing me to react this way? So sociologists, one of the things we do is we are very interested in unearthing assumptions. We're very interested in what people take for granted and in exposing it to the light of day so that we can ask whether the assumptions and values we take for granted are actually good for us or not. So at least liberatory sociology does that. So I had this kind of reaction to the Joe the Plumber quote and went, okay, and now I want to articulate what's wrong with this. And in doing that, it became clear to me that my ethical impulses were very suspicious of ethics that were built on kind of concepts, because again, there's this sort of abstraction in concepts and values. Unless you know who's using them and how and to what end, you don't really know if they're doing good in the world. And
Hmm.
so I came to this in some ways very reductionistic and in some ways very expansive way of thinking about ethics that basically asks, is a given value or idea or action or community or organization or institution enabling people to flourish, or is it not? Or is it actually causing them avoidable harm, avoidable suffering? So I got there and I thought, okay, this works for me. But now flourishing is super vague. So, what do I mean by flourishing? So then I kind of went into Martha Nussbaum's capabilities ethics, and which is the closest thing I found to what I'm doing, and looked at that. She basically says, ethically speaking, we ought to be helping people live into their full capabilities. Now, her work is largely centered on the global south and is largely a really rich, interesting critique of the global north and the ways that it has harmed the global south. So I totally recommend that to people.
Hmm.
Um, but I wanted something that was both a little more universal than that, and also something that was a little more sociological. And so I hit upon this idea of asking, what are the kind of non-negotiable, universal human attributes through which we flourish, because it's not enough to say we flourish as individuals or we flourish as human beings broadly, or we flourish in our social groups, or we don't flourish because we're in a devalued social group. Like, that's all true, but
Mhm.
that doesn't actually help us make concrete decisions. So I kind of went back to situational ethics, which is a rich set of ideas developed by, I believe he might have actually been a Catholic priest, I'm not sure, but Joseph Fletcher in the 60s. And he basically said, in any given situation, the most ethical thing to do is the most loving thing to do. And I thought, okay, now we're getting somewhere. But what is the most loving thing to do? How do we discern what that is? And so, I began to write about human beings as embodied, as emotional, as meaning making, as relational, these different kind of aspects of who we are. We're creative, we're moral, we're also immoral. We are broadly defined spiritual, we are broadly defined creative, and so on. And I've come to think that we flourish or don't flourish or suffer largely through those attributes.
Mhm.
So this, of course, is an entirely secular approach to ethics. Any religion could use it or engage with it, but secular humanist atheist people can as well. But as I was kind of making my move into progressive Christianity, I realized that there seemed to be this really good fit between these ideas and progressive Christianity as I understood it, especially in the kind of work that Jesus did, in the ways that he lived, in the values that he lifted up. He didn't, as far as anyone knows, use the word flourishing, but he certainly said and did things that to me were about human flourishing. And
Mhm.
I argue in the book that I think he got that from the prophets, from which, as an observant Jew himself, he was essentially descended, and that there's some evidence that the very earliest followers of the way, communities after him, also cared about some of these matters. And then when I started thinking about the kind of most interesting contemporary progressive Christian theology that I'd read, it all came together even more. So
Mhm.
ultimately, what feels true for me, and people will engage this in different ways, is that there are these kind of theological and philosophical claims that we can make about what love might look like, about what following Jesus might look like, and so on. But ultimately, it comes down to very practical behaviors on a day-to-day basis. How are we tending to our own flourishing? How are we tending to the flourishing of our neighbors, our communities, our enemies? That's probably the most controversial material in the book, but I stand behind it, and I'm happy to talk about it. So that's how this set of ideas that again began for me in this really more political context that wasn't tied to either religion or spirituality,
Mhm.
but over the course of its development, it just turned out to be this really interesting, not deconstructive and not reconstructive, but actually constructive sort of engagement with this more open-hearted and in some ways more humble form of Christianity.
Yeah. I found the part in the book where you kind of go through those 10 attributes of humanity that we all kind of share very helpful, because you, in each section, you kind of paint a picture of like an example. You talk about what that attribute is, but then what it looks like to flourish in that attribute, and what it
Mhm.
looks like to suffer in that attribute. And that was very helpful for me. I was wondering if you could speak maybe a little, maybe even give us a couple of examples, because again, coming from my background, I think a lot of our listeners come from the same kind of place that I did. We were taught that, I can't tell you how many times, I'm almost embarrassed to say it, how many times I was told everybody has the same opportunity to flourish, right? Like everybody, we all start at the same place, the
Right.
same playing field, and it's up to you as you grow what you're going to do with it. But everybody's got the same opportunity, and that's how I grew up. That's just what I thought. And then I thought that even when I pastored a church, I thought the same thing. But then I left the church, and I've talked about this on the show before. I went to work at Apple for
Mm,
11 years, and I worked in a store with 150 people. And now I'm starting to work with people who are, black people who are lesbian, people who are gay, people who are trans, all these different types of people. People who are Muslim, Jewish, atheists, all different types of people, all different types of backgrounds. And I'm like, wow, not everybody's the same as me, right? It was just a light bulb moment for me. And all these people who now I'm interacting with, who I were told growing up, are either evil or they're wrong or they all have the same opportunity as me. I'm starting to see that that's not true at all. And so again, this particular section, going through these 10 attributes and being able to see visually and being able to read examples of what it looks like to flourish, looks like to suffer, I started to realize that flourishing for me as a white middle class male was much easier than it is for a lot of other people in the world. So if you could speak a little bit to that, I think that would be great.
Sure, there's a lot of kind of different ways to speak to that because you've covered a lot of ground there. So I think um, the individualistic strand in today's, let's just say, U.S. evangelical Christianity is not particularly Christian, and I may
Mhm,
offend some people by saying that, but what it really is it really represents some specific cultural aspects of US American capitalism and some strands of US American sort of civic religion that have gotten hooked in with Christianity, but that are not in any way inherent to it.
mhm,
So I think we need to start by going all the way back to Jesus the Jew
mhm,
and the fact that most of the people he was talking to and telling stories to were poor, sometimes desperately poor, usually Jews, who were living in an oppressive situation. So the Romans had colonized Judea,
mhm,
um, and had and could, cause suffering at a whim. We certainly know stories about every time the Jews tried to have any kind of uprising against Rome, Rome would just crucify hundreds or thousands of them. There are some
mhm,
stories about that, and there's some evidence that this happened. So here's a people who are, first of all, poor, and second of all, becoming economically poorer because the Romans are changing some of their um, economic practices. So these people are poor anyway. They don't really have any of the kind of venues of protest that societies like ours today have, because if you protest, you're likely to just get summarily killed.
mhm,
Um, you know, um, and so Jesus is living and breathing and working in a society in which no one is claiming that everyone has equal opportunity, but no one with any power is trying to change how unequal it is because the people with power are benefiting from the power.
mhm,
Um, so his stories simply assume there are social and economic and political and religious hierarchies, and they kind of come out of that, and in certain really important ways they challenge that. All of this makes it, I think, very hard for a very individualistically minded, libertarian leaning evangelical Christian in the US today to read those stories and figure out what they say in today's world. Because again, in our society, even those of us who tend to lean left or be politically progressive, and even of those of us who didn't grow up as evangelical Christians, have been completely enculturated by this individualism. We have been taught that people rise or fail on their own merits.
mhm,
And one of the things for me, I sometimes joke that my real religion, in fact, is sociology. And what I mean by that is the core assumptions of how society works that sociology offers us. Those are the things I absolutely believe without reservation. I have been completely, to use a Quaker term, convicted of them.
mhm,
Whatever my religion, I genuinely find the sociological approach to human interdependence, to the ways that inequality works, to the ways we are socialized to understand the world and how that impacts us. I find those things to be simply true.
mhm.
And so that means that I start with the assumption that our society, like all society, has some hierarchies,
Yep.
has some social, political, economic, moral hierarchies. And what that means is, A, we don't all rise and fall on our own merit. Because we have social patterns of inequality that make it easier for some people than others. Um, but also that means that we don't flourish or suffer strictly for individual reasons. So I'll give you a concrete example. Um, I have fairly bad arthritis in my knees, and so I live with some degree of physical discomfort that is unfortunate. It hasn't stopped my creative life, but it means that I can't go out and run a marathon.
Right.
Um, One of the reasons that I have arthritis of that sort, and I'm under 60, but one of the reasons I have it so young is that I used to weigh a lot more than I do now, and that is partly because I used to have a pretty self-destructive relationship with food, which I'm very comfortable talking about, which has, thank God, changed. Um, but when I ask, well, why did I have that problematic relationship with food? Some of the answers are very specific to my individual history and my individual family dynamics and things like that when I was a kid. But some of them also have to do with some of the ways that it's hard to be female and queer in this society. And so, on the one hand, some of my suffering around food really was very unique to me and my own
Mhm.
story. But some of it was a coping mechanism having to do with sexism and homophobia.
Yeah.
So, in a society, if I had grown up in a society with less sexism and homophobia, I actually might not have arthritis today. I know that sounds kind of weird, but what I'm trying to do is honor both the really kind of unique idiosyncratic elements of my life and also set them in their social context,
And
which
how
is to say,
connected those things are, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so
Mm.
I one of the many other things I do, I actually do anti-racism training specifically for white people as a white person, because we if we want to work against racism, we cannot expect members of BIPOC communities to do all of the educating. That's not fair. So, you know, um, so I'm very mindful of, since I've been talking about some of the ways that I have sort of devalued identities, I also have this hugely valued identity in our society, and I benefit from it constantly. I am an inveterate speeder when I drive. I calculated recently that since I got my last speeding ticket, which was in, I believe, 2004, and it's the only speeding ticket I've ever gotten, I have sped over 20,000 times and not been ticketed. And that has included driving past dozens of marked police cars,
Yep.
but they never stop me
Yep.
because I'm not a problem.
Yep.
And so that is a way in which I kind of benefit, and that lets me, believe it or not, kind of flourish in some really concrete ways. Like if I'm running late to church, where because I'm the musician at my church, if I'm running late to church, I just, put my foot down on the gas and go, and I'm essentially positive that I can speed past a cop and not be stopped,
Yep.
which plenty of people who have darker skin than me do not have that luxury. Um, and this also means, of course, that I am just about never worried that I'm going to encounter police violence that will end my life.
Yep.
So that is, in our society, kind of a luxury. So in this sense, there are all sorts of really concrete day-to-day ways in which my identities have some impact on my well-being, my physical well-being, my psychological well-being, my access to creativity. I'm going to pull up one of my absolute favorite quotes from chapter 3 in the book. This is from African American author Ralph Ellison, and he wrote it decades and decades ago. Um, and he wrote, "This is a world in which the major energy of the Black imagination goes not into creating works of art, but into overcoming the frustrations of social discrimination."
Mm.
And so that to me is a tragedy. And it's actually a tragedy for all of us, because if we think about all of the people who have some kind of devalued identity or multiple devalued identities, who don't have the bandwidth to give the world their absolute all because they're too busy kind of coping with discrimination or the fear of being harmed, whatever it might be. I mean, imagine all of that energy and all that imagination freed up just to make the world more joyful. So
Mhm.
imagine someone with your level of wonderful visual art creativity, right? Someone who can do the kind of stuff you do, which is absolutely beautiful, but someone who doesn't do it because they don't have the resources, or they don't have the emotional bandwidth, or they're too busy coping with discrimination on a day-to-day basis. Maybe they're female and trying to navigate in a sexually violent world. Maybe they're poor and trying to find their next meal. maybe they're Black and trying to avoid getting killed by the police. But all of us lose when that person cannot be creative.
Mhm.
And so this way of thinking about kind of ethics and well-being ultimately assumes our interdependence as people, and ultimately assumes that in at least certain ways all of us flourish better when all of us flourish better, which
Yeah.
is not how individualistic US culture tends to see things. So
Yeah.
I was talking about the book with my church group. They're reading it right now, and one of them said, you know, what would you say? I'm going to push back a little bit. What would you say to someone who said that this book advocates socialism? And I said, I would ask why we assume that socialism is inherently bad, and I would ask us to have a conversation about economic systems and what's good about capitalism and what's bad about capitalism, and what maybe could we change in it to make it better. But you know what this book really is it is deeply suspicious of relying too much on concepts or ideas or systems for guidance, and
Yeah.
always just keeps coming back to real people. Who are we in the world? What are our lives like? What would make our lives better? How do we take care of ourselves? How do we take care of each other?
Yeah, I mean, what I appreciate about the book is it's not trying to argue me out of it's not trying to argue me out of like my maybe my faith tradition, or it's not trying to argue me out of my ideas or my beliefs, but it's trying to get me to think about something from a different perspective. And
Yeah,
even while I was reading the book, especially again these 10 things that you go through, I was thinking back to my time at Apple. And I remembered I hadn't really thought about this instant this instance until I read this part of the book, and it came back to me like in a flash. But I remember one day I was just starting to rethink my beliefs, just starting to like deconstruct. I was like, "Ah, I don't really know what was going on in my head, but things were exploding, synapses were firing, and I was like, something's going on." But there was just one day where this guy I had come to work, and I you know how you get to a red light and it changes and you're like, should I go? Should I not go? I just went, right? I just went. And there was a cop there, just like you had said, and I was like, oh man, I'm gonna get nabbed. Nothing. The cop let me go. Didn't even flinch. He saw me, but he didn't do anything. I'm like, oh, phew. Got to work, ran in, clocked in on time. My friend, who was black, he was late that day, and he apparently got pulled over. Maybe it was the same cop that saw me, maybe it was a different cop, I don't know. He got pulled over, and he came in, he was visibly distressed, like, really upset, and he was in the back, almost like tears in his eyes, and he told the manager, "I just need a minute, need a minute, need a minute." And later on, he told me, he said, "I got pulled over," but he said, "I wasn't doing anything, and I don't think I was doing anything." He said, "I looked at the speed limit when the lights went on." He said, "I was going the speed limit," and he said, "I got pulled over." And I asked the officer, what I did. The officer didn't answer me. He just told me to get out of the car. He's like, and now he's like, I'm shaking at this point. He's like, I had to get out of the car. The cop went through my car. I think he said he might have got patted. I don't remember the whole story, but he was visibly upset. And I was like, man, like it just blew my mind because again, going back to everybody's born with the same opportunities. We all have the same thing. And I was like, man, like that's not true. Like there is a huge difference between the way the world sees my friend because of his skin color versus the way the world sees me. And this particular person, going back to what you had just said before, was a very creative individual. He was a musician, a photographer, incredible, incredible gifts. Like he could do things with computers to make music in like seconds that would take me months to even figure out, right? I mean, super gifted. But he even remarked that like the space that the world is in and the things that he has to grapple with because of the color of his skin makes it very difficult for him to tap into that creative energy sometimes because he's so distracted with everything else. And I thought to myself again, wow, like I can go home and speed through a red light, and chances are pretty good I'm not going to get pulled over, and go home and I could work on my stuff and not have to think twice about it because I don't have to think about those things. But for him, it's just entirely different. So I think that all that to say, I think this is such an important conversation because I know for me, I often thought of flourishing like if the society is flourishing, everybody's flourishing. If right now the society doesn't seem to be flourishing at all, but there were times when it seems like the stock market's up, things are going really well, rah rah America, everything is going great. So you tend to think, especially somebody who's a middle class white guy, everybody's good, but that's not true because there's a difference between societal flourishing and individual flourishing, like you've so beautifully brought out in your book. And I think that for me has been the biggest distinction that I took away from this book. So thank you for opening my eyes, and I'm sure many other people's eyes, to things that we need to be thinking about.
Mm. I'm so glad it was useful in that way. The different people I talk to on these podcasts have they engage with really different pieces of the book. So this is kind of an interesting um, an interesting take on it. And I really like it's interesting because on the one hand, I really like your distinction between societal flourishing and individual flourishing. And at the same time, I think one place where I would sort of invite the next question is, can a society as a whole really be flourishing if enough
Right.
of the individuals in it aren't? So I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I'm saying to me the next interesting question is, then I don't really ask it in this book because it's more focused on the individual level or sort of the group level. Um, but what would a whole society look like if in fact we all sort of brought our moral commitments to everyone having some access to good things? And then this is so hard. I mean, there's a reason why chapter 6 focuses so much on kind of cultivating virtues in ourselves, because
Hmm.
becoming committed to doing this, and I don't mean by this just going out and doing justice work. I mean, that's a piece of it, but it's
Yeah.
also literally finding the courage to rethink what we thought we knew,
Yeah.
which is hard. And your story is sort of a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, is it's, societal flourishing versus individual. It's a lie that I think that we've been told, is that society's flourishing, everybody's flourishing. Society, if everybody, even if everybody's not flourishing as individuals, as long as society looks good, then everything is good. Like that, I feel like that's, like you said, it's not true, because how well is society really doing if the individuals of that society aren't doing well? And I remember I had this conversation with somebody about various political figures. I'm not going to name the names, but we were talking about, different candidates getting in, and this one person said, "Well, if this particular candidate gets in, and this particular group, kind of takes over, in the past, the economy's done much better. Society seems to flourish much better." I said, "Okay, but what if that particular person gets in and starts removing different rights from different groups, right? Like different LGBTQ people, women, things like that. Like, what if those people start losing rights that they fought really hard to have? Is society doing really well because the economy looks better and because things look better on paper, when those individual people's lives are now more miserable on a daily basis because of the rights being taken away?" Like, and that was a discussion that we began to have. I remember the person, like, the light bulb went off, and they still were kind of arguing for their case, but I think that they had now something to think about. And I think that that's what your book is doing, is giving us things to really think about. And when I think about, like, what can we do as people? Like, what can the everyday person who works a 9 to 5 job, who's trying to pay the mortgage and just try to make it through the end of the day, like, what can that person do? And I think that you so beautifully just said it, is be willing to rethink some of your ideas. Be willing to rethink some of the things that you've been handed, that you've taken as gospel, so to speak, over the course of your life, and wonder, what if this isn't really the best way? What if there's a better way?
And here to me is where this actually comes back into Christianity. Um, I think, and I've sort of written and talked about this in some other venues. I think Jesus actually calls us into discomfort.
Hmm.
He was willing to make people uncomfortable with the things he said and did. He was willing to suffer discomfort to an astonishing degree. Um, and I think that in the particularly wealthier white evangelical world, there is a tremendous emphasis on kind of being comforted and being comfortable.
Yeah.
And so, one place where I think progressive Christianity at its best, it doesn't always do this well, but when it does, it's pretty good. It says two things to us about discomfort. It says following Jesus means being willing to live into at least some degree of discomfort. That
Mhm.
might be discomfort because our ideas are being challenged. It's discomfort because we're being asked to tend to and love people who we don't like, who we are different from, who may even be threatening or harming us, thus the loving our enemies piece. So, part one to me of progressive Christianity on discomfort is we are invited, called into discomfort. And part two is we are guaranteed that underlying love, that spark of creativity at the heart of all things, that however we image God or the divine or the sacred, that he or she or it or whatever language you use, that we will never be left alone in our discomfort. We are invited into discomfort, but that presence, that hope, that capacity is always there with us in the discomfort, helping us wrestle with it.
Yeah.
Um, and so maybe there's even something holy about the discomfort itself. Maybe this is like Jacob wrestling with the angel.
Yeah.
His hip is put out of joint, so he's injured, and yet he comes away with a blessing and a new name. And I think we are invited into various kinds of discomfort today. And if we're willing to wrestle, we will receive new names. We will receive blessings. We may limp for the rest of our lives in a sense, but it will be kind of to the betterment of people. And I have to believe that whatever else God wants, God wants us to have joyful, humble, grateful, productive, beautiful lives.
That's right. That's right. So good, Amanda. We are just about out of time, but this
Yep,
has been so much fun. Thank you for your work. Thank you for this book. Thank you for making time for us. I appreciate you.
absolutely. Thanks so much for having me here.
Yeah, and real quick, where can people go online to interact maybe with you and your work? Any particular website you want to point us to, or social media places where you inhabit?
Sure. So two websites and one social media location. My writing is on https colons / amandaudis-kessler.com, AMANDAUDISKESSLER.com. And there's also information about the books there. My free use progressive worship music is available in score, recording, and video form on a second website. And that website is queersacredmusic.com. That's all one word. So https / queersacredmusic.com. And I am on Facebook where I'm fairly active. So feel free to just look up Amanda Udis-Kessler on Facebook. I'd love to hear from you. And I look forward to, maybe hearing from a few people. And I create free use music on commission. I do not charge for it. So if you are a member of a congregation with progressive values and you need a new worship song, please get in touch. Let's have a talk.
Love it. Well, I'll put all the links in the show notes, and I'm sure we'll do this again sometime.
All right, you take care.
Dearly beloved, we have assembled, joining in wonder, singing in praise, lifting our eyes, raising our voices, trusting in hope, in love, and in faith. Hallelujah, 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 God is great. Queerly beloved, we have been hated, treated as outcasts, ragged and rough. Still we persist, joyous and grateful, trusting that grace is ever enough. Hallelujah, 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 God is love. Queerly beloved, we have discovered love that is perfect, ending our fear. is a truth waiting to claim us. There is a call so strong and so clear.